delightful to be here in a space where we can engage with you around some of the experiences we're having. And I love that this is a space for engagement. And so I'm hoping that in the last half an hour we can really get some dialogue going and that those conversations continue. As Vince said, that's how we started our collaboration, is following some discussion around stuff that he'd presented. And that's really what we love about presenting our work. So really to get as much feedback as possible. So just to say, yes, I hold the South African Numeracy Chair, which is one of two numeracy chairs, but numeracy mustn't be confused with numeracy year, because really they chose the term numeracy because it's early primary mathematics education, and at the time our curriculum called that numeracy. Now our curriculum calls it mathematics. So probably if they set these chairs up now, they would call them the South African Primary Mathematics Research Chairs. So that's just to clarify, because I know numeracy here takes on a meaning right through the curriculum. In South Africa, we have mathematical literacy at the high school level as a compulsory alternative to mathematics, and that's much more similar to the numeracy in the curriculum year as it goes up into high school, and relates well with the work that Vince has been doing. So within that chair, which started in 2011, there's various projects going. We do a lot of development work, and I'll speak a little bit about those, and we do a lot of research work, and we have students in our research team who come in and work in the development programs and then link their research to those programs. And Sally Ann, partnering with her in this chair has been absolutely delightful. Sally Ann comes from a teaching sociology of education background, very strong language background, is a colleague of mine at Rhodes University, said, oh, so the stuff that you're doing sounds so interesting. I said, you know, we really need people with a lot of strong language skills for us to understand what's going on in the maths classroom, not just all the maths lenses and the maths literature on language and mathematics. I think we could really benefit from that. And so Sally Ann started a PhD in the program. She graduated this year. She got wonderful feedback on her PhD and is now postdoc. And so we're presenting on that research journey, and in particular we're presenting on the last year. Since she kind of completed her PhD, we've been working on a paper for ESM, and we're very happy, but yesterday we did our final changes. And so we're really presenting on that post-PhD, getting it into a publication process that we are quite excited about. So it's really a slice of our chair work. But if anybody wants to discuss any of the other projects with me, I'm here till the end of the year. I'm here on sabbatical. I'll engage with any of them. I know Chikri, I did the family maths and the parent stuff at the conference at QAMT that Chikri hosted. It was an absolutely lovely conference. Thank you. So just to give you a bit of the context that we're working in, because as Vince says, you know, we've just been at Merga, and Sally and I kept saying, it's so obvious how different the context is, even though, of course, there's some similarities. So in South Africa, we're both famous and infamous. We're famous for Mandela. We're famous for our 1994 democracy that Mandela brought. And really, that was a relatively peaceful transition. We're infamous, of course, for apartheid, which we still face the legacy of that today. And we're infamous for the extreme inequality which persists, as well as in educational terms. Whenever there's comparative studies, we tend to be right at the bottom. So that was the TIMS, where we sit right at the bottom. And while you can challenge international comparative studies, we sit at the bottom of regional comparative studies as well, doing worse than countries like Malawi and Mozambique, who are much poorer than us and spend less money on education. So somehow we've got major challenges that we need to understand better. So as I said, our extreme inequality persists. We do have among the highest inequality in the world. And it's the highest. Our apartheid past explicitly undermined learner agency. Now that was for all students. We very much had Christian national education, and it was very much about kind of learn like a parrot. Teacher talks, learners take in, very much transition model, but especially for Black African learners, it was very much you don't particularly need education, and certainly you don't need maths education if you're going to be a labourer. So Verwoerd was infamous for saying, why teach the Bantu child mathematics? So that's some of the legacy that comes particularly in mathematics. And so access is still a challenge, and Sally Ann's going to talk more about this. But while we have access, most of our learners are in school, compulsory education for all learners. And there are schools, there's still some schools where there's no running water, toilets are a problem, schools are dysfunctional. But one of the big access challenges is language, because less than 7% of our population are first language English speakers, but a quarter of our foundation phase learners are learning in English. They come into school, we now have a grade R year, grade 1, they're learning in English. And by grade 4, that jumps to almost 80% of learners are learning in English. So if we look even at the department's own, we had annual national assessments, but like your NAP plan. After 5 years, the teacher union said we're not doing these anymore. They're just about naming and shaming. They're not particularly telling us how to improve. You're telling us we're bad at fractions. You're telling us we're bad at word problems. Tell us something we don't already know. It's not telling us how to improve. So they're looking now towards more diagnostic assessments, and another project within our chair and across the other chair with Hamza Venkat, we're looking at some of that stuff and drawing a lot on the Australian work on these learning progressions. But you can see, and the paper that we're going to be discussing with you today looks at grade 4 learners, you can see the drop from grade 3 to grade 4. That's the national average. 56% in grade 3, suddenly 30% in grade 4, national average of 11% by grade 9. These are on our own, not rigorous international. These assessments can be critiqued for their standard. By grade 9, only 3% pass, or getting over 50% for maths. So by grade 9, the majority, 97% of our learners are lost to studying mathematics. They're forced into that mathematics literacy stream. Some schools don't offer mathematics. They only offer mathematical literacy. So the research and development context that I'm working in, for kind of when this chair started in 2011, up until then, there tended to be all education mathematics interventions were focused on high school and mostly at that grade 12 exit level. Let's quickly have those kind of catch-up programs. And increasingly the discourse has been changing, saying we've got to intervene earlier on. And one of the reasons why we love coming to Murga, and I bring my research team to Murga, is there's so much engagement on primary here. And within the Southern African context, there's not a lot of engagement on primary. You know, by starting these research projects, we've started the engagement on primary at these conferences where there was almost no engagement on primary. And so these chairs were started, one at Wits University, Hamza Venkat, one at Rhodes University, and it was all about, we know we need to look earlier on, right from the start of schooling, what do we need to do there? And I mean, my background was in senior phase, kind of in that primary to high school transition. So it was quite a jump to go and figure out, but incredibly exciting. We work in Grahamstown, soon to be renamed Makanda, I've heard, which is really, I think, quite nice, given that Wakanda is such a buzzword at the moment, you know, the movie. So it's a small university town in a largely rural, poor, underperforming Eastern Cape province. We're one of the poorest and educationally underperforming provinces. Our education has been so dysfunctional that national has taken over. So our province no longer has ministers its own because of that level of dysfunctionality. So there's a lot of challenges in the Eastern Cape. And the chair's mandate was basically to run professional development projects. We're all about teacher education, and then to research and find ways forward to these challenges, and then to speak nationally and to engage internationally. So that's the mandate. So the rationale, of course, for this mandate of, there's about 150 South African research chairs across the universities in the country. Ours is also within those, but there's only 6 of these research and development chairs. Our mandate is we have to do development work, and we have to prove to the private donors in those chairs that in fact we're having impact. So I have a whole lot of research that's all impact, you know, that I don't publish on, but I give to the, and then I have a whole lot of research that's about more qualitative. How do we actually deal with the complexity of this, which one then publishes in journals? So really the idea, yeah, in these chairs, and Professor Mamokgethi Sitati-Pakeng, who's a big language expert in the field of maths education, was instrumental in saying we have to merge research and development. We have to develop partnerships if we're going to have to understand what needs to be done better, as opposed to kind of this research on teachers, which often leads to, I think, inauthentic data. So the argument is that both research and development benefit when the work is grounded in teacher and learner experiences, and that the authentic data needs, in fact, the development of those trusting relationships. And so my sense of working with all the doctoral, postdoctoral, and master's researchers in our project is that they have incredible access to gathering research, to empirical data and spaces to conduct their research, because they are then part of a bigger community and a trusting space. So it has this benefit for all. And of course, many of those teachers and those department people involved in the projects then come into our research. So you worked with Roger Metlerkamp, who was a teacher, came into our program as a teacher, grade 4 to grade 7, in one of the tiny rural coastal villages. And yeah, so Conceptualize the chair work is really trying to create a hub of mathematical passion, activity, innovation. So try to conceptualize it beyond just the professional development we were mandated to do. And some of that was about my reason for wanting to set it up as communities of practice. Was some of it was about that in the Eastern Cape, if you didn't work to developing powerful communities, things weren't going to work in the same way, because to some extent, in Grahamstown being a small university town, these schools had been over-researched, they'd been over the object of, without the object of benefit. Whereas in Joburg, you've got, the work I did in Joburg, it was so easy to get access to anything. Yeah, you really needed to develop a whole new way of being before you could start actually engaging with what might even be the way forward to the challenges. So yes, we had 3 professional development programs. They've been long-term, a grade 3 and 4 one, a grade R1, grade 1 and 2 one. The one ran for 5 years, the others ran for 2 years. We'll still do one for grade 4 to 7 coming up, because as I say, this has been going since 2011. But we added a whole lot of maths clubs, which the idea there was to work directly with learners, allow working with those learners to inform what we as researchers and project people might be doing with our research-informed resources with the teachers in the PD. So they gave us direct access to the kids, but the idea was that the learners in these clubs would have, because they're all after school, they would have the opportunity to work with maths where we focused on developing powerful reasoning, engaging mathematical dispositions, which aren't part of the normal kind of school ethos. So the idea was if we could work with these learners in these schools on those kinds of ways of reasoning, talking, engaging, we'd sit on the floor. There was no kind of the teacher above and talk and argue and push them, come argue. Try to change a way of speaking about mathematics so that when the teacher asked a question to say, how did you get that? There's somebody who actually is confident to answer it, and we have some evidence from teachers that learners were becoming catalysts to model what might be an answer. And you'll see in what we're talking about today, we're not seeing that kind of thing happening, and clearly there needs to be more of it. And then we worked with families as well in various different projects. Not going to talk about that today. Spoke about that at MERGA and at QAMT. But as I say, anybody wants to chat to me about that work, I'm happy to. So really, and then I'm going to hand over to Sally Ann, the communities that we chose to work with were all the communities. Teachers, that's what we were mandated to work with. Added some direct work with learners so that we could in fact then, let me rather use this, so that we could in fact then get our own experiences of that. But we also worked with teachers, with learners in the clubs. Some of our departmental this is kind of the government, the level of, they generally used to go out and inspect teachers, okay, and pass on and tell teachers what they need to do. We've partnered with them that they come in on the professional development and they sit alongside teachers and engage alongside teachers. So we also have departmental advisors who are also then, have become researchers, who are also then researching clubs and running programs on how to run math clubs with teachers and then themselves doing some research on it. So kind of the idea of these communities and spaces is that each of these projects, the professional development projects, the maths club projects, the family events that bring teachers, families and learners together, in all of them one's trying to create a space where it's all about mathematical engagement. It's not about passing on information of this is how you teach it, this is what you should be doing, this is what the curriculum says, or even to learners, this is the mathematical content. It's about creating a space where people engage meaningfully with new ways. So some of it's about shifting the power relations in bringing these people together. So what's been incredibly powerful, is departmental advisors and teachers being in the same space, with researchers who are also sometimes, and teachers who are also sometimes researchers. You're starting to have a dialogue between researchers, teachers, departmental advisors, which hasn't been there before because it's tended to be a top-down as opposed to a here's a resource and now we engage. Okay, so that's just to give you a feel for, as I said, it's a relatively dated picture. I haven't updated it for a while. There's how our kind of researchers, okay, and again, there's a few new ones who we could update, but our researchers across. So each of these programs provides a platform and an empirical field for our researchers to research, but they only get access to it because they're participating and contributing developmentally to giving something to the communities. And so for Sally Ann, okay, sat in the professional development for 2 years with us, participating alongside teachers, and then when she chose her focus of her study, approached 2 of the teachers she'd been sitting with alongside in the PD and said, I'd like to understand more about classroom and mathematical talk practices. Can I come? Can we? And they were thrilled to have her. Okay, so yeah, I won't go into all the others, but each of our researchers who are also teachers, there Roger's a teacher, Zanele Morfu and Gasanakaleta Hebe and Naluntu Bart, they are all district people, all involved in running projects and then involved in researching them. So, over to Sally Ann.
Thank you, Mel. Right, folks, I always feel a little bit anxious because I'm not a mathematician. I do come from a very different place, as Mel explained. And my main work has been in the field of sociology of education and multicultural education. So I'm very deeply concerned with understanding and trying to deal with issues of equity. And so my first slide is to do with this access versus access. Melanie mentioned that the government has done a lot of reform since post-apartheid 1994, our big watershed moment. And it may surprise many people that prior to 1994, while there was compulsory education for white learners, for colored learners and for Asian learners, it did not matter if a black child did not attend school. So from 1994, education for black children in our country became compulsory. So for the first time we had universal compulsory education. So on the physical access side, things got a lot better than they had been previously. But my argument, coming as I do from where I do, is that the issue of access is much more than simply a chair in a classroom. It's got a huge amount to do with access to powerful forms of knowledge, mathematics being a key powerful form of knowledge, and barriers to that access, which is where I come in, which is the issue of language. So, as Mel mentioned, the majority of learners in South Africa are not learning in their dominant language. And there has simply not been sufficient, in my view, support and recognition of the challenge that poses to a child in terms of accessing any form of knowledge, let alone the powerful forms of knowledge. So that's my starting point, this whole inequitable setup that exists in our country, even though we're ostensibly a democratic, fully franchised country. So the conceptual struggle that is a feature of mathematics education worldwide, I would say, is moving away from a rote-oriented way of teaching mathematics where there's one right answer. And I've used the phrase teaching and learning because our teachers too have had the invisible apprenticeship of all the years of schooling, and it's really hard for them to move towards a new, more conceptually oriented and exploratory form of engagement with mathematics. So that is our big conceptual challenge, that for me, one needs to take a step back from that conceptual challenge and look at the access barriers and my particular interest, namely this fact that you're learning in a language that you can hardly speak. And I was very struck, both Mel and I were very struck with many of the Merger presentations at Auckland 2 weeks ago, suddenly, where there was a lot of talk where the assumption was that children could talk in the classroom, and then a lot of very fascinating work being done about how you up the ante on that talk to get children to be much more closely involved with reasoning. Now we, I'm afraid, in South Africa, given our statistics, given our language situation, are far, far away from that. And as Mel and I are going to show you when we get to some of our classroom transcripts, the level of talk will probably fill many of you with a sense of despair. Okay, so in terms of our presentation, we're focusing on one teacher, pseudonym Miss M, and she was doing a lesson on the relative sizes of different unit fractions. And she wanted to get her children to understand the inverse order relationship, namely that a quarter is bigger than a quarter is bigger than an eighth, even though if you're talking whole number terms, an 8 is bigger than a 4. And I know that a lot of research has said that children struggle to make meaning of this. But the struggle that our children face is that they're having to face this struggle through a sort of veil of very poor understanding of the classroom language. So the research question for this paper that Mel and I have just produced for ESM is, what is the nature of the talk in this observed lesson, and how does it enable or constrain the meaning-making process in the classroom? So, coming as I do from a language background and a sociology, multicultural background, I take a sociolinguistic perspective. It's broadly Vygotskian, that the culture is what shapes the nature of the learning that takes place. I use Douglas Barnes, who's done a lot of early work on the role of talk in the classroom, and his work has been taken up by people like Neil Mercer at Cambridge, and he set up various research teams around the role of talk, but it was Barnes who he pays tribute to when he's talking about his forms of talk. I also use Jim Cummins, who's a Canadian academic who's done a lot about the distinction between social language and classroom language, and the challenges that those pose, and then Pauline Gibbons, who's one of your countrymates. She's a sociolinguist, and she's done a lot of work about how you move children's capacity to use language from the everyday spoken-like way of discussing things towards the more formal written-like way. So, moving first then to Barnes, it's Barnes who coined the term exploratory talk, which Mercer and other people like that have taken up. And he was very much convinced of the value of talk before you start moving children into the more formal written forms of writing about whatever they're learning. And he said one of the wonderful things about exploratory talk is it gives you that chance, and I love his quote here, to think aloud, to talk your way into understanding. So it's a very ready tool for trying out different ways of thinking and understanding. So when I was going into my teachers' classrooms, what I was really looking for was evidence that there was some kind of exploratory type engagement with the mathematical work that they were doing. That's a story that Mel and I will get to just now. Then Cummins. Cummins has contributed hugely in the second language acquisition field and is a particularly powerful theorist, I think, for helping teachers see how they should handle language in the classroom situation. So he has this very useful quadrant diagram where he looks at the level of cognitive demand that's involved in a task, a talking task or a written task, and he talks about the extent to which it's embedded in context and the extent to which it is reduced in context. So what Cummins argues is that it makes sense for one to always start, it seems self-evident, to start in context, where it is relatively cognitively undemanding and embedded in context, and then gradually one moves down into quadrant B, where it's still context embedded, but you're starting to up the cognitive demand. And then final move is towards cognitively demanding and context reduced, where you're using the academic language of mathematics or whatever subject one's looked at, and one's going into the general principles, understanding the underlying principles. And he made the point that there's very little point in being in cognitively undemanding context reduced spaces, but he says very sadly many classrooms stay there, where children copy notes off the board or they learn things off by heart. So I find his framework a very useful one. Linking to this is Pauline Gibbons' distinction, where she says that as teachers, it's our role to help children move along the modes continuum from everyday ways of thinking and talking about things towards the more formal ways. So she uses the term more spoken like, though it's not necessarily all spoken, and more written like, though written like language can also be oral. And she's identified these characteristics of everyday language. It's interactive. It involves turn-taking when it's responsive. It's got a lot of contextual clues, gestures, posters, etc., etc. It's dynamic. You can pick up when there's a misconception happening. It's largely unrehearsed and spontaneous. It uses everyday vocabulary. No worries about grammar. And it uses high-frequency words, which are your commonly used words. And then the academic language is moving to a much more formal way, a much more fixed and static way. I'm not going to go through those. But it strikes me in looking at Gibbons' everyday language column there, that's the kind of talk that sits very nicely with Barnes's concept of exploratory talk. That it isn't fixed and it is dynamic, and you can take a chance to move back and forth and pick up problems and make things more accessible to children. Our next slide is Miss M, my teacher. Let me introduce her. She was acutely conscious of the fact that language was a problem. For her, she saw herself as, she had a very strong identity as a mathematics teacher, whether or not that was warranted or not. We won't go there. But she loved maths. She could see no problem with maths. She could not understand why her learners, as we call them, you call them students, I think, her students struggled so. So she says it's very important because maths isn't only about numbers. There's lots of language involved. There's English language. That's a challenge for these learners. And there's the maths language. So they've got this double whammy of trying to get to the mathematics language through the medium of instruction or language of learning and teaching, whichever phrase you prefer. And she says there's no learning and teaching that's taking place. So she has this sense of profound frustration And yet her school has a very strong language policy that says you may not speak in isiXhosa, which ironically is the language she and all of her learners speak. There are no English children in the classroom. Okay, so going back to Cummins then, and his concept of Bix and Culp. I'm sure many people will have encountered those concepts before. They're not without their critics, but basically Cummins makes this distinction between Bix, which is your basic interpersonal communication skills, and Culp, which is your cognitive academic language proficiencies. And he is a big advocate for the development of Culp in the mother tongue. So he says, although the surface features of isiXhosa and English might be different, interacting socially is not different. And similarly, in relation to Culp, if you develop your Culp, I know Joel's talking on reasoning and all those kinds of things, if you develop those kinds of reasoning skills, you don't have to relearn them in a second language. All you have to do is transfer them across. And his argument is that it's much more strongly developed if it's in a learner's dominant language. So I find his dual, he calls it his dual iceberg metaphor, a very helpful one for showing how there is this huge potential for cross-linguistic transfer, which is not achieved if you have a school language policy that says you go straight for English. Okay, so then here's my effort at portraying the different options that are available in South Africa for bilingual education. Unfortunately, the comment has been made, we were so constrained under the apartheid era that we perhaps went a bit mad on the democratic front. So a comment that's been made about our language and education policy is it errs too much on the side of choice. It's up to the parent and the school governing body to decide what a language policy is going to operate in a particular school. So model A is straight for English. You just go straight for English. Which is the our Miss M. The more preferred one from a departmental aspect is the early transfer, where after the first 3 years of establishing your literacy, basic literacy and numeracy, you move across into the second language. Research through Africa, and you have Professor Kathleen Huch here at the University of Adelaide, who's done a lot of work on multilingualism and a lot of work in African countries, is that Model C is probably the optimal one. And of course, first prize, if English wasn't such a prized language, would be to have some form of dual medium. But in South Africa, such is the distrust of the motive for mother tongue education that parents opt for English. That is first prize. If you've got a little level of income comfort, then you send your child to an English-only school. And the parents see this as a kind of opportunity. Sitati Fakeng makes the thing, the social goods. English gives you access to the social goods. It also gives you access economically. It gives you access to tertiary education. So parents see all those goods shining in the distance, and so they choose English for their children without any realization of the epistemological consequences of that choice. Okay, so as Mel said, straight for English is the model that is used in our school, and there's a huge policy anomaly there. Because it's straight for English, English is regarded as the home language. So all of our little isiXhosa learners are regarded as English home language learners. And ironically, isiXhosa is taught to them as if it was their second language. So, I mean, you really don't have to look far to see some madness going on here. And the unfortunate thing is that the second language curriculum, which I've been very much involved in writing textbooks for English second language, gives you the kind of support that would help you develop the Culp. But when you go for the English home language, it assumes you already have those skills. You have an inherent knowledge of how to use language. And the final point I want to make is people see this as an immersion model. In other words, children are immersed in English. But in fact, it's not an immersion model, because neither the teacher nor the children have English as a language, and they have no access to peers and English-speaking classrooms, so classmates. So we call it a submersion model, which often drowns people. What
So this is different.
The X model C is the former white. That's the euphemism for the former all-white schools, which are generally better resourced and more privileged. Okay, so in terms of trying to analyze our lesson text, which Mel and I are going to move to now, we had tremendous difficulty trying to find a coding framework that would work. But we eventually came up, and that's what you've got there, with these three categories of talk. Talk that's embedded in the lived experience, talk that more closely aligns with the academic, and then in the middle, that talk that tries to mesh your BICS-type talk with your CALP-type talk and invites the child to start exploring ideas. So Mel and I had this idea. We don't know if it's going to work, but I need my glasses.
And some of this, just while we're talking, some of this came from, initially we tried to categorize with Cummins quadrants, and some of the challenges that cognitively undemanding stuff that we were seeing when the teacher's saying this is called a numerator. Let's get the term numerator. Let's remind, those are cognitively, they are linguistically complex, but they're not mathematically cognitively demanding. So it's very hard when you've got linguistic complexity on big words, but in fact the demand is just straight recall. So there's no cognitive demand. And we had no way of solving that cognitively demanding. So when we were saying, well, the question about what's this called, a numerator or denominator, isn't cognitively demanding, reviewers were saying, of course it's demanding, because it's a hard word. So we couldn't get around that. And so after two lots of reviews, this is what we got to. And finally our reviewers are saying, yay, they're happy with it. But it was a lovely process to go through, seeing that those cognitively demanding things from a linguistic perspective and from a mathematical perspective obviously overlap but aren't exactly the same thing. Okay. All right.
So we're going to do an experiment with our
presentation. We'll read it. And what I thought, Sally Ann, which we didn't do yesterday because we didn't have more people, but when you see SS, that means all the students chorused. So chorusing is a big feature in South African classrooms. You'll say, we call this a numerator, and we call this a, and the whole class will chorus. It's a big feature. When people come to our classrooms, they're like always a bit shocked at the kind of chorusing, you know, and it's a sing-song. The bottom of a fraction is called a denominator. So there's a little bit of that.
So could you be our chorus?
So when you see SS, then it's all of you. And I will be Lonwabo and whoever else. Oh, I've got the...
Mel, yeah, some of them didn't have both sides printed.
I think they all do, except for... No, you've just got the wrong... Yeah, there we are. Have you got a double?
Yes, okay. I have. So I'm Miss M. Lonwabo, we have done fractions for quite a long time. I'm not going to draw anything on the chalkboard, but if I'm saying to you that there's this cake, do you like cake?
Yes, ma'am.
Who doesn't like cake? Who doesn't? You don't like it, Formula?
No, ma'am.
And so she then carried on for about another 10-15 minutes, asking them, some of them offered chicken as what they liked, or fish, and they had no idea that the fraction lesson is to do with dividing up
Kentucky
a regular
Fried Chicken came up. Chicken's very popular in South Africa.
So then she starts, you can see she's starting in the everyday. Then she moves straight across into the more calc-like. She writes a quarter on the chalkboard. What do you call this fraction first? Lonwabo?
1/4.
1/4 or?
One quarter.
Ah, good. And then this one, and she writes 1/8 on the board. What do you call this one?
1/8.
Okay. Lonwabo, would you rather have a quarter of a cake or an eighth of a cake? A quarter of a cake or an eighth of a cake? And why? Which one?
A quarter.
A quarter? Why not an eighth? Our chorus is dumbfounded.
So she looks to the whole class and still nobody's got it.
Why not an eighth? Because you say you prefer to have a quarter, not an eighth. Why? 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 Which one? Lonwabo does not like to have a quarter, but he doesn't have an actual reason. Wazini, do you like cake or not?
Yes, ma'am.
You do. Would you rather have a quarter of a cake or an eighth of a cake? A quarter of a cake or an eighth?
Quarter.
Why?
It's bigger.
She says a quarter because a quarter is bigger.
Yo.
Yeah, you see,
Yeah.
expressions of surprise.
Yeah.
She says a quarter is bigger than an eighth.
Yes.
Is it true?
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
I'm not so sure. And so we go to a fraction chart. And Tando, come and show me. Show me here which one is a quarter, which one is an eighth. Then we can agree. And so they go to the fraction chart. She points to the eighth. The child points to the eighth. They point to the quarter. And which is bigger? And they can see on the chart a quarter. And then we see one tiny little snitch of illicit kosa creeping in there, airway, which is kosa for yes. A quarter. So then she goes back to Pumla, who had said she didn't like cake. So she said, which one would you choose, Pumla? A quarter or an eighth?
A quarter.
A quarter? Why?
Because it's bigger.
Although you don't like cake, you still want a bigger slice of the cake?
Yes.
Even though you don't like it? Okay. Yo. Silumko, which would you choose, a quarter or an eighth?
A quarter.
A quarter? Reason?
Because the quarter is bigger than the eighth.
And that's when Miss M sighs a big sigh of relief because the child has given the right
Full
answer.
sentence.
Full
Because
sentence.
the quarter
We all
is
remember
bigger than the eighth.
comprehension tests where teachers insisted on this ridiculous idea of a full sentence. So I don't think we want to go through
No,
because
so
I
the
think
teacher
time is getting a
repeats.
bit short.
Yeah.
But she goes on and on and on, and then they still haven't got this idea of the inverse relationship between the quarter and the eighth. So then she gives up and she moves to start getting them to identify different sets of fractions.
So you can see all the fractions there, and she asks each child a quarter, an eighth, a half, a fifth, a seventh. They see all of those, and then she moves on to now what's the same about these fractions, what's the same, what's common, and they say it's the ones. And then she moves into, so what's this called? It starts with a N, it next is a U, and numerator. Thank you. Then the student says nominator. She says nominator. Now he's reminded you denominator. All the students say denominator. So basically she gets them to be doing the naming of what's this, and then she asks somebody to write something on the chalkboard. They write a whole number, and she says, is this a fraction? No, it's not. Why is it not? Gets them to get it's a whole number. This is what a fraction needs. A fraction, it has to have a numerator. So kind of just working with this kind of technical representation and the naming of it. But that idea of what made the quarter bigger than the eighth, the more you divide it up by the smaller the fraction. That's really where you're going to with the quarter and the eighth. And with those fractions, that generalization of the using of the cake to say, but if I share it by more, then none of that was forthcoming. And yes, she doesn't model it either, but we're thinking that exploratory language, even though there was the opportunity for it in those why questions. I mean, I can't imagine in an Australian context where the teacher was going, why, all the children would just be quiet. I would think there would be some level of talk, even if you might have to mediate the reasoning. Be completely silent like this. Okay, so that's interesting because then it says there's some relevance to this as well.
So we just got our little things there. Moving on then, in terms of the overall lesson, which was 372 turns, you see Miss M starting in the everyday. You see her moving towards kelp territory. You see her trying to mesh the bix and the kelp, but she gets nowhere. So then she moves back into kelp territory, and she goes back, and she's just being frustrated at every turn. And then she gets them to naming the parts, and that's relatively successful. But remember the opening line of the lesson, we have been doing fractions now for a long time.
So it's really
so
recall.
it is really a source of major concern for us that the children are not able to engage in a kind of exploratory talk that will lead to deeper mathematical meaning making. Okay, there is a breakdown from our ESM paper of the entire range of utterances from the children, and we've divided them into the more spoken like, more written like, but you can see how very limited their verbal capacity is. Where am I?
And you can see that nowhere is there more than a phrase. There is no exploratory talk requires that you, but I think that if we cut this up, or that kind of spoken like grappling, thinking your way, what's the wonderful quote? Thinking your way into talking your way into understanding. That's what that cake potentially could have done. But you can see from that there's none of that. You're either every day it's KFC, we love chicken, chicken's great, or it's, you know, the academic kelp type short words and phrases and very right answerism.
And the three sentences that begin with the course, where you might think that a reasoning chain is about to begin, is simply making statements that have already been established. It's a statement of fact. It's not an evidence of reasoning. Okay, so that's just a statement about the design of our sheet of paper, which I won't go to, but the bottom line is she never managed to get the children towards that generalized inverse relationship idea, the generalized principle. The bigger the denominator, the smaller the fraction. Okay, and so a lot of work has been done over a lot of years in South Africa promoting the idea of mother tongue education. And one of the big writers there is Carol MacDonald, who did a very big study on our Maltino project and the Threshold project, which was at what level of language proficiency would children be ready to transfer across into a second language. So her work has been very influential. But she is saying that our children are still swimming up the waterfall. And she used this to show how it's almost impossible for children to engage in genuine meaning making while they are struggling in a language that they're not proficient in. And that's where Cummins' Bix and Kelp is so important, because he said that it's quite easy for children to get the basic interpersonal communication skills. I can remember in my days as a teacher, children I had a little Hebrew girl who came in speaking only Hebrew. She learned very quickly in the playground to communicate, but that Kelp takes much longer, and Cummins cites many studies that show it's 5 to 7 years in optimal circumstances, plenty of exposure, not the submersion model that's operative in Miss M's situation. So the implication is that we must find some ways of helping to hold both the languages in place. You can't just pretend English is for elitists. English is a very powerful language. So we need to find ways for helping children develop both the L1 and the L2, so that there can be that conceptual transfer that Cummins talks about in his dual iceberg. And it's critical for learners if they're going to be able to make meaning in the classroom, which clearly Miss M's learners were not managing. We didn't mention the statistics, but her
I think it was
75% of her children scored less than 50%, with most of them scoring less than 30% on annual national assessments. So it's a very sad story, and it needs advocacy, and it needs parents to see the consequences of the choices that they're making.
And of course, what we haven't shown yet, and we didn't do in the ESM paper because you don't have the space to do it, but the other teacher whose class Sally Ann went into was a from grade 1 isiXhosa, from grade R isiXhosa school. In fact, a slightly poorer school, even though they're right opposite the road from each other, than Miss M's school. And there's a lot more talk going on with the Y. And in terms of their annual national assessments, doing similar to hers, even though a poorer school, but in terms of our chair assessments, where we assessed across the Kilpatrick strands of proficiency, her learners were much better at adaptive reasoning, strategic competence, and conceptual understanding. So even though on the fluency they weren't any better than Miss M's, on those reasoning items they did way better than Miss M's.
It was a research nightmare having all the talk happen in isiXhosa, which I have only limited access to, but the findings just speak so strongly of the value of mother tongue.
And I say that just to offset the kind of
Yes.
sadness of this story.
Yes.
Because this really is what's happening when it's a choice of straight for English by parents. These are not wealthy parents. The school fees are incredibly low. But the little money, so they're minimum wage workers. The little money they have, they want English for their kids, so they're paying for the school. And yet, we believe the kids in the school
In the non-fee
opposite,
paying
in the
school.
non-fee paying school, which is way less resourced, etc. In fact, your kids are better off in terms of their opportunities for making sense. But also both teachers participated in our professional development and both wanted to implement more talk-based practices. And we believe it was much easier for the one teacher, given the context, where she was allowed to...
She had permission
She had permission
to use the
to
mother
use,
tongue.
yeah, mother tongue in grade 4, even though at that level her learners were going to write the grade 4 annual national assessments in English. She constantly taught in both languages. But her kids had learnt in isiXhosa from grade 1 to grade 3. They learnt those foundations in their mother tongue, and she was then using both to move into the kind of grade 4 more abstract mathematics that jumps from foundation to intermediate phase.
So it really is quite ironic that despite all the knowledge that we have about the role of language and the importance of the dominant language, that you can't fight the status attached to English. And while one might think this is an exclusively South African extreme example, it's an increasing with all the migration that's happening, refugees, and I know that in the States they're starting to sit up because their Hispanic population is growing, so they're being forced to look at the language issue much more seriously than before.
I mean, we were even thinking, as I say, we've been thinking a lot about this immersion issue, because when we present, people say, but we know immersion works, you know. And we were thinking, how come in the States are they, because I know a friend of mine has gone to the States from Spain, you know, the Spain economy collapsed, she went to the States. Texas was bringing in teachers to teach the Hispanic learners from grade 1 to grade 3, because they've come up with a policy that from grade 1 to grade 3, those learners must learn in Spanish. Why? They know that all the learners in those schools are Spanish speaking. So there wouldn't be immersion, there wouldn't be 3 Spanish kids coming into an English school. They're all Spanish kids coming into a now, do you know what I mean? And so it's interesting to see how, even in the most conservative Texas, they seem to have said, okay, we need to get some Spanish-speaking teachers to teach these kids in their mother tongue, because they've got to that critical mass where it's not just about, well, we can immerse them in. And as I say, I mean, there is evidence in South Africa to show that those learners who come from a slightly better socioeconomic background, where their parents can pay for them to go to an
Immersion
ex-Model C
schools.
school, immersion schools, they are doing fine. So there's nothing conceptually wrong with these kids, or it's not that culturally they don't want to do reasoning. Because we know when they go into those immersion spaces, they do well, they thrive. You know, and even the kids from minimum wage parents, because there's a lot of domestic workers who get their kids into the ex-Model C schools in South Africa because they live on the property, so their kids get to go to the wealthier school in the area. And they fly. That's immersion.
And ironically, most of the teachers in the township schools where we do our research send their children
To those
Model
schools.
C schools. They don't keep them in the schools where they were. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.